Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So in this video, what I'm going to be talking about is I'm going to continue on with part 4 of my user services. And most importantly, what we're aiming for is expanding on that user context idea. So I'm going to be creating a user context unit of work that extends on and encapsulates our repositories. In order to do that, we have a few things that we have to update. We will be changing our controller so that it functions with the user context and not directly with the data context now. And we are also going to be upgrading some of our models so that they interact with our data, our new data model with our IUserEntity and the IEntityTypeConfiguration interfaces. So let's begin here. So when we um, when we look at what we need in a user context, we're going to have, first of all, we're going to need the user type that will be referenced throughout this, and the user key. The user type is really more of a thing that I'm going to have internally, so that if I'm ever referencing it internally, I can always use the, in this case, an application user object, and then the key, which for that application user, the key is a string type. So I'm going to be referencing that quite frequently. The string type is the one that I'm looking for, and that's the T user key. All right. From that, internally in this unit of work, what we're going to have is several repositories, right? So one of the things that we've been interacting with is our company group, our company model, and we're going to be wrapping a repository around company so that we can interact with it directly. It'll be its own little entity, and we don't have to do a lot of overrides on that one, so we're just going to be keeping it a basic implementation on top of the base user repository. Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to put my user context in my data folder. And because it's essentially data that we're working with, um, there is also going to be a few configurations that we're going to modify in some of our classes as well, but we will move along with that and we'll get to that in a moment. So our user context, as I mentioned, requires a T user and a T user key. As usual, our T user in this case is, let's correct my spelling, our T user is a type of class. Oops, I should say T user. And say class, and it's an IEntityTypeConfiguration. Okay, you might be tempted to make it an IUserEntity, but it's actually not a user entity because it's an entity on its own. It has an ID, but it does not have a user navigation property. Okay. Company, however, is an IUser entity, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So we have that is an IEntity with I user key, and then we have I user key, which is an I equitable user key. Okay, excellent. So with that, what we can now do is we can start pulling in some of those repositories that we started with. But first, what we have to do is bring in the application DB context. Now it's going to be a wrapper essentially for this. So here we have our application DB context. We're going to call this underscore context, and we're going to add that to, I love some of the features Visual Studio because what I could do here is have this nice little generate constructor for me. Now, puts all the information that I need, sets me up pretty easily, and as I start moving ahead, what I need to do here is I'm going to start using some of those repositories. Now, the company repository, I'm going to create a company repository right here in our repositories folder. And I call it companies repository. Now, companies repository is an implementation of, let's see, it is an implementation of, excuse me for a moment, of base user repository. Okay, the T is a company. The T user is an application user. And T user key is string. And the T key for company is a string as well. Now, this is complaining here because it says the company and application user are not compatible with this interface, and we're going to go ahead and fix that right now. So let's just go over to company first of all. And the reason is because company at the moment is an IEntityTypeConfiguration, which is great if all we need is the ID, but for our base user repository, we need an IUserEntity. Okay, so we need to add a few more features. This means that we have an application user, which refers to this field right here. We have the user key, which is a string, and then the string that relates back to the IEntityTypeConfiguration is this string that's related to company. Okay. Now it's complaining about application user not being set up correctly, so we will easily go over to our application user, and the reason here is because it's not an IEntityTypeConfiguration. Okay. At the moment, it's not, but now it is. So you can see that all the errors disappear now once we've connected those models correctly, and they all are now related to one another. And again, just to reiterate, application user is an IEntityTypeConfiguration only because it just has the ID property. In this case, we have the ID property because IUserEntity inherits IEntityTypeConfiguration, which means that we have the ID, a user ID, and a user property as well. Okay, so let's go back over here. Now, when we think of our company repository, we'll just go back and make the corrections that we need to actually have this wired up correctly. And I'm going to, it's complaining because it says it actually needs the constructor. And what we want to do, let's just see if we can actually just say, yeah, it'll implement it for us. Just easy peasy here. So we have our company's repository. It's configured exactly as we need it. We can now begin using that in our user context. Now, this is fairly straightforward. It's a private read-only company's repository, and I'm going to call this company's repository with an underscore. So from over here, I can do this. Company's repository equals new company's repository, and we just simply take in the context. So as simple as that, we now have our access to our company's repository. Now, we haven't really done anything special at the moment. We haven't got any ability to connect user with this at all. What we have though is we have the company context and an application DB context. There's nothing that actually sets the user into this method here. Now, I used a method in our user base, our base user repository for setting the user. So I'm going to go over and steal some code. The code over here, let's just pull this. We have our set user and our get user. Now, I could certainly throw this into a service, and we'd avoid some of the code reuse, but I'm just going to keep it very simple today. We're just going to have a little bit of code duplication, but the intention is still there. So what we have right now is we have a set user function, and it accepts the claims principal similar to our base repository, and that means that when we are setting this user, we're also going to set the user on the repository as well. So at the same time, it's complaining that we don't have this variable set, so I'm going to add a field for user ID, and it returns, as we've seen before, it returns the user key. And once more, it's just because it's going out to the claims principal, getting the claim ID, converting it to the user ID type that we require, and then giving it back to us over here. Since we have that, we can now do this. We can set the user on the user context. And just like that. Now, oops, sorry. Hang on a second. Set the user principal right there. Now, we're sending in the user principal into each of those repositories so that it can deal with that user as it needs to be done. If I just said, here's the user ID, it might be not safe to just supply a user ID. Once again, I'm following this down through the workflow of an HTTP context where it has this claims principal. Now, the next thing that we also will be doing is setting. Let's see. We want to give a reference to our company's repository so that people can actually interact with this. So I'm going to do a reference here, company repositories, companies, and this is just going to return with our company repository. You can wrap this in a property field if you want, but I'm just going to have it interacting directly with the company's repository. All right, so with that, I think our user context is pretty much ready to go. What we want to do next is we actually want to start looking into our company's controller, and we want to investigate how can we sort of take apart our controller and eliminate some of the code that we use. Okay, so we are using application DB context and user manager. We're also using a repository that represents the company, so we actually don't need pretty much any of these at the moment. We're also going to make the user context an injectable service. So one of the things that we have to do first is go into our program CS. We're going to add a scoped object to our user context. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's go over to Program CS. And all we have to do here is builder.services.addScoped. And this is going to be a user context. Okay. If you recall, we know that the user context is interacting directly with our application user. And it uses a string as the key. Okay, so that's scoped now. One of the things that that as well happens here now, I'm not going to finish the middleware at this point, but I will be coming back to it. So with that, now that we know that we have access to our user context, I can now inject our user context into the controller, and that's coming in as this here, application user string, and this is coming in as user context. So I'm going to add a field there, and all we need is we can remove this and this. Okay. Okay, and we're pretty good there. I'm going to do my little rename with the underscore. Great. So with the user context here in place, we can now begin by referring to that that user context whenever we need to access use the company data in this case. One thing that I do kind of like doing is using a standardized naming convention for accessing my repository. The reasoning is that if I'm always having to call userContext.companies, it's just a little more lines of code. It's just longer, right? But if I can just call repository and that represents the company's repository, I'm sort of just reducing and cleaning up the code a little bit. So as something that I will do, I'm going to say that this is a company's repository, and straight up naming convention, very simple, is repository. It will be just a getter. I'm never going to set this because it doesn't need that. And we're saying this. We're saying if repository, actually, what are we doing here? So what we're going to be saying here is that if the repository is available, then, or is not available, so one of the things I like to do is make my access to my repository in the user context more consistent with naming conventions, because I'm only ever acting with one repository here. So I'm going to give it a common naming convention. I'm going to call it repository. So with that, it's going to be returning a company repository. And this property is just simply repository. It is a get only, so read only. And we're going to do this. So we're always going to be interacting with our repository variable. So I say if repository equals null, then let's see, repository equals user dot companies. Okay. Now you can see it's giving me an error. I know exactly what that error is, and I'm going to explain it in just a moment. And with that, we will return repository. Now, the reason it's giving us an error is that this is the declaration here. We created our company's repository previously, so now we actually have something we can work with. What is it giving me an error for here? Let's understand that. Maybe null. So is that going to be a nullable? I see what the problem is here, because I have it marked as read only. But it's a private variable, so we're not entirely concerned about that. So let's move along. Now we have access to our repository. And again, it's just as in a general naming convention that we can work with quite easily. Somehow we got an extra bracket in there, so we just correct that little problem. All right, so let's move forward here. Now, one other thing that I do tend to like doing is giving us a private set that I'm always going to refer to. In other words, rather than calling repository.getAll, I'm going to use a set property, and again, it's a private async task, and it's going to be a function that returns an iQueryable company, and I do it like this. So I simply do a return and await. I don't need those brackets. Repository dot get all. Okay, so these two little features here will make it very easy for me to copy and paste, let's say, a new controller, and I can always with minimal effort, I can make some subtle changes in the code, and then I've got it very easily implemented for yet another controller or another entity type. So when we move down here, I don't need my set anymore. That's what we had before. We had it wrapped in a get statement that was getting based on the user ID. So we don't need that anymore. And we've still got our set that we were using before, but now that set is using a statement that is encapsulated in our repository. All right. These things we're going to eventually get rid of. We've got our find and we've got ensure user ID. We don't need these things now because they are encapsulated in the base repository and in the user context. So our index is in fact very simple right now. We can actually do this. I don't need to say to create a variable for it. I can take away some code there. Our details, pretty much the same, but what we have here is repository.find. Okay. So repository.find is now how we're interacting with it. We're always going to be interacting directly with the repository. Create. nothing changes there, but our create post method does change. Now, one thing that I mentioned a short time ago, I think in part 2, where was that I'm setting this ID right here. Now, that's never really a good idea. You should always let the database handle it. You can do this way if you like. I personally don't like doing that. So what I want to do before I get too far is I'm going to make some configuration changes onto our company object. All right. So I'm going to get into some entity type configuration. So for this, we're going to look at, we're going to call this company configuration, and we're just going to change this so that it has a key and some interaction with the application user. So this is an IEntityType configuration of type company. Okay, we want to implement our interface, and there we have it. Sorry, builder.hasKey, and there we have it. And the key is ID. We also want to add a few properties to this here and ensure that ID will always be using a default SQL when it executes. The default SQL is going to be new ID. Okay. Now, for application user as well, we have a little configuration to do as on that side. So we'll do public class application user configuration. Now this is just going to be configuring the foreign key relationship. Entity type configuration, and then we have our application user. Okay, let's implement that. Excellent. Okay, now builder dot property, or excuse me, has many. All right. What we're looking at this right now is has many companies with one company, or one user, excuse me. And it has a foreign key, and the foreign key is user ID. Now, if we, what we can do here is trigger an on delete. It's not always a good idea to delete everything if something like this happens, because it could be pretty catastrophic if someone deletes the user and they delete every entity that's associated with that user as well. So the delete behavior, we're going to say client set null. All right. Now you don't really have to set that, but it's generally a good thing to do to ensure that you have everything set up the way it should be. Now, since we've created these configurations, what we'll do is we'll go over to our IApplicationDB context and ensure that they are part of the model on model creating, and we'll just do it like that. Builder dot apply configuration. I'm going to do a new application user configuration and copy that line and company configuration. So now that those are both configured, I'm going to now add in a new migration and update our database. Okay, add default SQL to companies. Okay, we're ready to go here. So let's just double check. We've got companies. The ID is applying a default SQL. We've also set up a foreign key on our application users. That's our ASP.NET users, by the way. And let's go ahead and apply that update. Excellent. Went off without a hitch. We should be totally good to go. All right. So we'll go back over to this. What that means now is that I can take away the need for creating a GUID every time I add. I also don't need to ensure the user ID because that's going to be handled within my repository. And now I can just rename a couple of these things. So I'm adding the company to the company repository, and then the company repository is doing the saving. So I've eliminated yet again a couple more lines of code, which is very important. So let's move on to our edit. Now edit, the only thing that we are bringing back in here is repository.find, and that allows us to interact directly with our repository again. And you're going to see that we have this funny little code that comes up all the time. I'm going to reduce that code in just a moment once we get to the delete section. You'll see that this code is exactly the same every single time for details, delete, and edit. Now, for edit, it may not always be that case, which is why you kind of want to be a little bit cautious about how you reduce code in this respect. But in the way that we're doing it at the moment, I can safely reduce the code for details, edit, and delete. The reason I say with edit is sometimes you may want to load other entities in the edit. In other words, you may want to fill a drop-down list with data from a related object, but I'll show you how to reduce some of the code here as well. All right, now we'll go down into our edit post function, and once again we can reduce some of our code here. We're using our repository.find. And in this case, I was saying exception not found. If you recall, we did something like this in our base repository. But one of the things that we can actually do is we can have our repository report back rather than throwing the error here. We can actually have the repository report that information back. But I'm going to go with this right now just for clarity. Okay. And that is because ID, we couldn't find the ID specifically in company. Now, I'm also doing this here. I'm finding the ID. There is some type safety here. I want to make sure that my ID and company ID are correct, and I've done that up here. So at the moment, at this point here, I can use ID or I can use company.id. It really doesn't matter at this point, but up here, I really wouldn't know whether I'm using it right. So I would default to company.id. Company.id is going to be the more safe approach because I know that it's going to have an ID that should match what's going into the database. This one is a reference to confirm that it's correct, and then I can, if I'm finding something in the database, I should be able to find it by one or the other, and they both should match. Long explanation for something very simple. All right, so I'll eliminate a line there. Now you'll see here, we haven't dealt with anything like this. I'm going to hold off on doing that, and maybe we'll put it into part 5 for this series. What we're thinking about here is in the edit state of company, it only means that it doesn't matter what I changed on my company. The only thing that's changing is going to be name. All right. So for a post operation, I'm changing name. For an add operation, I'm using the name that's coming in. So for a web API context, this may be something that's really important to recognize. If I'm posting something for an add, for example, or a create, I don't have an ID, so I don't need to supply an ID. But for an edit or update, I do need to have an ID, but I also don't need to change it. So in this case, those two entities are the same. But in some cases, I need an ID to go into, maybe it's a collection that is part of company. In this case, if I was posting to my application user and I want to add a company to that, I could provide an ID of that company and add it to that collection, and that's really all I need to add to that collection. I don't have to have the whole company. I just need to have an ID. But digressing, so I'm going to keep working forward and fixing our little code challenges here. So we've reduced our lines a little bit. This line is, as I say, a little bit redundant, not entirely necessary. We have things wrapped in a try-catch, which is good. What I'd want to know here is what kind of errors would be thrown by the catch statement. So if the catch is going to catch a specific type of error, like key not found, I could deal with that error here. And that's how you really want to deal with your errors. You want to deal with them. They can be reported from your repository, but dealt with in the controller. All right, so we're saving changes. Let's see what else we have here. We also have company exists. That's another one that can be reduced. Because we know that repository also has an exists. I believe it's exists async. So we can replace that code, and that again allows us to remove one more thing from the controller, and that is down here. So we can just comment that out for now. All right, so we're in our edit. I think we also don't need this line because we're not filling a drop down of users anymore. And we're down to delete, and that has repository.find. So with that, I mentioned earlier that we have code that's pretty much duplicated in 3 areas here. What I'm going to do is I am going to condense that code, and I'm going to create a private function, private async task, and this is an IActionResult, details or delete. Okay, this one will accept a string because it's basically exactly the same code here, but we're encapsulating it so that it can have a couple different uses. All right, and here we have it. So with delete, I can return, wait, details or delete ID, and there we have it. So we kind of we've reduced code there, and if you recall, I said that we could do the same with edit. So we can do that there. And as I said before, now you may have conditions where you need to add more to your edit statement. So returning an I action result may not be ideal. You may want to respond to something in a way, but it may not be the best strategy to put into your edit. But in this case, we can certainly do that. And we can do that once again with details. Okay. Now, we also can get rid of our little functions up here that we don't need. And I will say one thing here. We have our get user ID. We have ensure user ID. We're going to have to replace all of this because at the moment we still haven't connected our user context to an actual user. We don't use our set user function anywhere at the moment. And to do that, what we have to do is we have to create some middleware. Now, this is one of the cooler features in .NET stuff. This is the stuff that I really like. And this will be a service that we set up. Now, this service, it's actually pretty straightforward, but what it's going to be doing is hitching on to the HTTP context and passing in the user from that if the user is authenticated. All right. So with that, now I've got code off to the side here and I'm coding as we go, but I will share code in a repository if you ask me for it. So I'm going to create a user context middleware. Actually, we've got to create a services folder. Okay. You could call it middleware as well. It doesn't really make any difference what you call this folder. All right. So our middleware is going to be invoking a call that takes the HTTP context and the user context. And remember, user context has a couple generics, so it's our TUser and TUser key. In order for our user context to understand what those are, once again, we have to pull that in. And they're the same declarations here. We also have any if you're developing any kind of middleware, this is basically the same patterns that you're always going to have here. So constructor, the constructor takes what's called a request delegate. Okay, it's generally called next. So we'll just add a field there as well. And once again, like my underscores there just for clarity, whether it's private. All right. Next thing that we do is we have a asynchronous function called invoke. Invoke takes a HTTP context, and that's going to be a context. It also will be injecting our user context, and it's taking our TUser as a parameter and our TUser key from up top. And this is going to be user context. All right, now invoke is just complaining, but it's a fairly simple thing to complain about. We've got it fixed mostly. So here is where we're going to connect up our user. So if it's identity.is authenticated, then what we can now do is to set user. Now, this is kind of a neat little feature. It's something I really love about the way middleware works. Why are we doing this? Well, for everything that we do in the context of a controller, anything that we would have done throughout this call, I would have had to request the user. So in other words, it would have been something like this, dot set user and user. Okay. Now, that's not functionally incorrect. I could have done that quite easily. But I don't really want to have all that code in my controller. I want to have some things that are just like set and forget. I never have to think about this anytime I'm creating controllers, because obviously you're seeing that there's a lot more stuff than we need in this controller, and I could probably reduce code just a little bit more, but the key is certain things, let's say it's a junior developer that's coming in on this project and you want to say, here, just set up these set of controllers. You really don't want them to have to think about things too deeply, but they should be able to get up and running and create these controllers without much hassle. So this middleware allows us to do that really nicely, and I love doing that with .NET. So now, one of the nice kind of cool little things that also we can do is we can set up a use function that will actually use this. And when we go into our program, by use, what I mean is something like this. It says use authorization. So what I'm going to do is set up one that says use UserContext middleware. So in here, I'm going to set up a static class, and that class is called UserContext middleware extensions. Okay, because it's extending on to our middleware. And this one here, very simply, I mean, it's not simple. There's some complication to it. It is going from the application builder. It's going to be called use UserContext middleware. Okay, and it also requires, because when we're using our middleware, we have to have a user ID or a user type and a user key. Same thing all over. Well, let's just fix our spelling there. And because it's an extension, we use this operator. So we're extending on the application builder. So that means when I type app dot in our program CS, it will automatically come up as that way. Okay. Now, with that, I do need to copy this back down again. All right, so what we're returning here is builder dot use middleware. There we are. And we have use middleware. And we bring down our T key, our T user key, and there we have it. All right, so this now allows me to, as my application is starting up, it will take the HTTP context that it's working within, set the user. In order to activate this, I'm going to put it right below the use authorization. Use user context. Now, of course, it's going to ask us for our parameters. And our parameters, if you recall, are our actual application user. Okay, application user, and the type is string. Very good. All right. I kind of think we're ready to give this a try, and let's hope that we all have the same return that we had in part 2. It's been a little while until we actually got to respond and run our applications. Let's see if we're still working properly here. All right, so we have an error. Let's find out what that error is. It's probably something really simple. Yeah, just this one. Somehow I missed that. It didn't actually get down to the confirm, did I? And we gotta change that and change that. I think we're in good shape now. Sorry about that, folks. Let's delete that too. All right, go for it. Something else I realized here, and I totally forgot, is in the evoke, I need to await the next function, and that is because it has it's a workflow that the middleware works with, and if it doesn't have next, it just simply stops working. Hence, when I attempted to do this, it just simply stopped. So I'm going to show you what happens here. It's probably a good little lesson, and something that it's easy to forget. So let's just show you what happens here. Okay, so you'll notice that it has a blank screen, and that is because nothing failed. It just didn't move to the next step where it actually renders the rest of the controllers and all the rest, and maps controllers, blah, blah, blah. So when we do await next, it allows that to happen. So let's get that up and running, and we should be ready to go. Okay. All right, let's log into our companies. Great. So we have the same information that we had before. We should be able to add a company. Let's just find out here what we get. And we do. If you remember, we had it, we wired up the default SQL so that the new ID was creating the ID. If I go to details, I have the information I'm expecting. If I go to delete, we're deleting properly. Let's just do some more deletes. Good. Add one more. Excellent. So everything's wiring up the way it's expected to. Let's do one more test here. And let's see, I think I set up a test user. Okay, so we're into test@test.com now. We'll see if we can create something, and we're still doing it in the same context. Looks like we are. So we don't have any mix over from user to user, and that's really important here because now I have a really nice slick flow of just user data that I'm working with. Amazing. Okay, so when we look at everything that we've done today, we've created a user context. We've managed our entities so that they line up with the user context and user repository. We also created a company repository. We modified our company's controllers so that it interacts directly with user context. And of course, what that allows us to do is simplify the code that we use in a controller. You could simplify that controller even further by possibly creating a generic controller. We won't be doing that in this series, but if you'd like to see something like that, feel free to let me know. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. This has been awesome, and and it's one of these epic coding sessions that I love. I hope you've learned a lot today. There was a lot of stuff in this lesson. If you do, remember to like and share. Always subscribe. Make sure that you share it around and tell everybody if you like what you see. And if you'd like a little more support, you can subscribe to a membership to my channel. It really helps me out. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.